November 1953, a group of CIA and Army scientists gathered in a cabin on a retreat in Deep Creek, Lake, Maryland. During the gathering, few people were handed glasses of Cointreau. Less than 30 minutes later, those that consumed the drink behaved so strangely that it was clear the alcohol was spiked. Of the scientists that had the alcohol was Charles Olson, a scientist at the top of his career. 10 days later, he jumped out of his hotel window in the middle of the night and fell to his death. He might have been one of the only people in the world that knew about Project MK-Ultra, but even Olson was not immune to the CIA's illegal human trials. MK-Ultra was a top-secret, unethical CIA program that involved conducting hundreds of secret experiments on humans, often without them having any clue. Their goal was to figure out how to control people's behavior without them knowing. They wanted to create hypno-program assassins who could kill on command, commit a crime such as murder, and then have no memory of their actions.
Was Charles Olson murdered because he knew too much? Do mind control techniques actually work? If not, why are so many countries looking into it? And did any of them find any results that we, the public, don't know about? I wasn't satisfied with the answers we were given, so I looked into what experiments the CIA did. And I did some experiments of my own, which we'll get into later. But for now, what do we know about MK-Ultra from the declassified documents?
Paranoia prompted the cruel operation. The world was forming a new battlefield, one that the deputy director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, would refer to as the battle for mind control. The agency experimented with many methods to manipulate a subject's brain functions by utilizing high doses of psychoactive drugs, electroshocks, sensory deprivation, and hypnosis. They also inflicted severe verbal and sexual abuse on participants. In the years after World War II, the United States was constantly on edge. Fear of communism swept the nation, and the country lost its nuclear monopoly. The nuclear arms race against the Soviet Union was in full swing. Supremacy would be the prize to the winning country. Welcome to the Cold War. But there were other weapons that the US needed to fight its enemies, which were far more discreet. Psychological warfare could be weaponized to tear people down and control their thoughts and actions. The Soviets were supposedly conducting similar experiments, and the US knew they couldn't be left behind, although some believe this was just a justification for the experiments. There were rumors that a mole had penetrated the CIA at its highest levels, and leaving them not knowing who they could trust. To add to their fears, US prisoners of war were returning from the Korean War in alarming mental states, like they'd been brainwashed. Millions of dollars were poured into studies to examine ways to control the mind, with a particular interest in finding out how to extract information from resistant subjects during interrogations. Ultimately, they wanted to develop drugs they could weaponize against their captives, foreign leaders, and the Soviet bloc. Sidney Gottlieb created and ran the operation. He was a chemist fascinated by methods of mind control and didn't care about the suffering he would inflict on his test subjects. The CIA was already working on Project Bluebird when Gottlieb joined the agency. Project Bluebird was an operation that experimented with interrogation techniques on prisoners captured overseas. Alan Dulles, deputy director of the CIA, ordered that Bluebird be expanded. Renamed Project Artichoke, Gottlieb continued his research of interrogation methods. One of the main things they planned on determining was if there was a way to involuntarily make a person perform an act of assassination. They used LSD to produce amnesia, morphine addiction followed by morphine withdrawal, and hypnosis. Experiments were carried out in-house and overseas. This is an excerpt from their own declassified documents. The concepts involved in manipulating human behavior are found by many people both within and outside the agency to be distasteful and unethical.
So 2 things to point out. First, the CIA knew it was unethical, but they still went ahead with it because they wanted to keep up with the Russians. And did you notice whenever they refer to the agency in their writings, that they always capitalize the word agency? That's significant because if you ever read religious texts, whenever God is being referenced as he or him, it's always capitalized. So it's almost like they're capitalizing the agency as if to say they're equal to or above God. Oh, and quick side note, did you know that the CIA was started by the Skull and Bones?
I remember a senator once asked me, when we talk about CIA, why we never use the word the in front of it. And I asked him, do you put the word the in front of God?
I'll be mentioning some things that sound like conspiracy theory, but I'll be referencing real declassified documents. So none of this is speculation.
During this time, Gottlieb discovered the effectiveness of LSD. Initially, agents used other drugs like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, peyote, and mescaline, but LSD produced the most promising results. Using mescaline on unsuspecting subjects began with Nazi doctors giving it to the unwitting subjects at the Dachau concentration camp. And forgive me if I'm butchering any of these names. I'm doing my best here. CIA agents were given the drug to determine its effects on unsuspecting people. One subject spent 77 days on the drug. Subjects left the project suffering from amnesia with foggy memories of their experience. Gottlieb found that the drugs often hurt interrogations rather than aid them. Dulles gave him authority to further his research, delving into complete mind control. And Project MKUltra was born. Dulles worked to make it known that the project was reactionary, based on the Soviet Union conducting a similar experiment. There is considerable evidence that opposition intelligence services are active and highly proficient in this field. The truth was that it was something they were working on independently, trying to catch their enemy before they could be caught themselves. Groundwork for MKUltra was laid in Japanese internment camps and Nazi concentration camps. Nazi doctors used mescaline at the Dachau concentration camps, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing some of these names, and the CIA was interested in furthering this research. At the start of the operation, they thought the drug was the key to mind control, so they enlisted the help of Nazi doctors involved in the original experiments. What a lot of people don't know is at the end of World War II, Nazi scientists either surrendered to the Russian side or to the American side. So most of the Cold War science was an extension of German programs. The space race was really German scientists in America versus German scientists in Russia, although Stanley Kubrick had no German help when he filmed the moon landing. And the same goes for MKUltra and any possible Russian equivalents, being that they were an extension of German science programs. Another interest the CIA had was in the Nazis' use of sarin and other poisonous gases. They herded ex-Nazi doctors to the center of the experiment, Fort Detrick in Maryland, where they spoke to CIA officers about how long people need to be exposed to sarin to die. They performed 150 human experiments involving paralytics, electroshock therapy, and psychedelic drugs. The unwitting test subjects were people the CIA dismissed as unimportant, like prostitutes, terminal cancer patients, drug addicts, and criminals. Gottlieb said that they were people who would not fight back, taking advantage of people already in vulnerable situations. One technique used on the subjects was to give them a barbiturate IV in one arm and then an amphetamine IV in the other. First, they released the barbiturates, making subjects so drowsy they'd fall asleep. Except, rather than let them sleep, the amphetamines were released right when they started to close their eyes. The stimulants would wake them up, but make them so delirious that interrogation was usually impossible. Heroin addicts were lured into the program and told they would be rewarded with more heroin if they participated in LSD experiments. Most times, subjects were only monitored for a few hours after the event, and nobody took responsibility for what they would do over the next few days, weeks, or even months. Many were completely traumatized and struggled to return to ordinary life. LSD quickly became one of the more effective drugs in the center of their focus. Gottlieb purchased and shipped most of the world's supply of LSD to the US and dispersed it to prisons, hospitals, clinics, universities, and other institutions. All recipients were asked to carry out research projects to understand the drug, how people reacted to it, and how to harness its effects for mind control. Volunteers found the drug pleasurable and encouraged their friends to take it too. The psychedelic drug gave them a high unlike anything they'd experienced before, and they were enthralled by the hallucinations. The CIA enlisted the help of New York psychiatrist D. Ewan Cameron, the author of the psychic driving concept that intrigued the agency. His theory involved completely erasing memories and then rebuilding the human psyche. The agency saw someone that knew how to harness the human mind and wasn't frightened of questionable experimentation practices. He used extreme sensory deprivation, intense repetition of recorded messages, and of course, drugs on his subjects. Cameron traveled to Montreal weekly to carry out MKUltra experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute. He didn't care about his patient's circumstances or the repercussions of the experiments. The main goal was just to beat the Russians. Some of the subjects were pregnant, but that didn't stop him. Patients under his care unwittingly became participants in the project. Some were placed in a sleep room where patients were in a drug-induced coma and woke up only for 3 feedings and bathroom visits. After the experiments, patients lost dramatic amounts of weight and were so weak that they could barely stand. Another technique Cameron used was he would break a patient's mind down to a childlike state using electroshock therapy and drugs. This would create a clean slate for him to perform reprogramming, which he referred to as psychic driving. He played recorded messages to patients through headphones, helmets, speakers, or even inside pillows. They listened to the messages for 20 hours a day and would hear them up to 500,000 times through what's called spaced repetition.
This part was most interesting to me. We know that kids pick up messages and learn things faster than adults. And we know that spaced repetition works, otherwise advertisers wouldn't use it. So for a whole year I tested this theory and blocked out any media that would come to my five senses, and instead selected study materials that I curated myself, and even played the audios while sleeping to reprogram my thoughts in my mind like Cameron was doing to his subject. And after the year was over, when I returned into sort of like a normal way of living, it was almost like I was an alien. It was so different. So I think the people involved who say MKUltra was a complete failure are just doing so they can distance themselves from any repercussions.
Subjects were barely able to function in society when they left the facility. They forgot how to do many basic things. One woman left the facility without even knowing how to boil water. Patients were sometimes so broken they couldn't return to their old lives at all, no longer able to care for their children or function within society. A related project to MKUltra was Operation Midnight Climax, created to study the effects of LSD on non-consenting and unwitting individuals. It was the most structured of the experiments and started in 1954 in CIA-run brothels in San Francisco, Mill Valley, and New York City. George Henry White, who worked with Gottlieb, ran the operation. Prostitutes hired by the CIA led clients back to safe houses, where they were given a variety of substances and studied from behind a one-way glass. After sex, and unknowingly taking the drugs, clients answered questions posed by the prostitutes, seeing if the setup would lead to revealing any involuntary secrets. Prostitutes were lured into the experiment by payments from the CIA, promised to get them out of jail if they were ever arrested for prostitution.
Imagine how scary this would be to go through unwittingly. Like hippies sometimes have a bad trip and they know they took drugs. But imagine you were minding your own business and you started tripping out of nowhere because the CIA gave you a gallon of LSD and you have no idea why you entered an alternate dimension. And as a little side bonus, now you're effectively retarded and you can't return to normal life. But hey, all in the name of science, right?
They selected men that went to brothels because they knew they would be too embarrassed to talk about the experiences. Some were exposed to subliminal messages to see if they would lead to involuntary actions, frequently criminal activities such as assault, robbery, and murder. No consideration for the well-being of the participants was made, and after they were forced into these trials, their lives were forever changed. Not only were their experiments cruel, but they were also incredibly dangerous. Nobody should have been forced into those tests, and some people who were experimented on later committed horrible crimes. Prisoners were a hot commodity throughout MKUltra. The public was shocked when the members of a cult known as the Manson family committed brutal murders. It was 1969 when a group of people broke into several homes and killed everyone they came into contact with, even writing words in the victims' blood before they left. They were notorious for taking large amounts of LSD. Their leader, Charles Manson, encountered it when he supposedly became a subject in MKUltra. Manson spent most of his life in prison, even before the Manson family murders. Upon one of his earlier releases from prison, he was assigned the parole officer Roger Smith, a Berkeley doctoral student. He became a participant in MKUltra, where he was given copious amounts of LSD, which built the groundwork for the Manson family murders. But not all victims started out as criminals. You might know Ted Kaczynski better as the Unabomber. When he was at Harvard, he volunteered for a psychological study led by a Harvard psychologist believed to have been working for MKUltra. Kaczynski was later given the title the Unabomber after he mailed a series of bombs to people across the country. Saran assassinated U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 in Los Angeles. His lawyer claimed that his actions resulted from exposure to MKUltra's mind control techniques.
Some people say the Unabomber had a few good points in his manifesto and was actually a genius and not so crazy. And I do believe there's a fine line between crazy and genius. Now, I read the manifesto, and whether you agree with the guy or not, you can tell they're at least coherently structured thoughts. Now, some people make the same claims about Manson, and I can see that too. And if you really dissect what Manson is saying here, are you going to tell me that these insightful words are the ramblings of a crazy person? I think not.
Do you feel blame? Are you mad? Do you feel like
Another cult leader, Marshall Applewhite, who led the Heaven's Gate cult, is also believed to have been an MKUltra subject in the army. With the help of the CIA, secret detention centers popped up in parts of Asia and Germany, particularly in countries under American control, like Japan, Germany, and the Philippines. The CIA vetted participants based on if they were potential suspected persons or people they viewed as expendable. After selecting their subjects, they'd kidnap them and throw them into cells. Subjects were forced into various tests, including drugs, electroshock, sensory isolation, and temperature extremes. While the experiments were being conducted, the CIA bombarded participants with questions. The goal was to see if these methods could destroy the human ego and break down resistance. They didn't just want to understand the mind, they wanted to know how to dismantle it. Gottlieb had the approval from his higher-up and was given permission to do whatever it took to conduct his experiments, with his superiors taking the stance that they didn't need to know the details of his work. In 1963, declassified report said that when it came to MKUltra, the present stance is to maintain no records, planning and approval of test programs. Without these restrictions, he could experiment on humans in the US and worldwide, performing whatever level of abuse he deemed necessary, even if it killed people. In 1973, President Richard Nixon removed the director of the CIA, Richard Helms, taking away Gottlieb's freedom to perform his experiments. Gottlieb soon left the agency too. Helms and Gottlieb panicked. They couldn't hide their deeds anymore and knew the dire repercussions they would face if anybody found out about the experiments they carried out. The pair destroyed all the evidence they could find, hoping they'd be able to burn everything before anyone could investigate them. In 1974, the New York Times told the public that the CIA had been conducting illegal experiments on US citizens. Congress investigated the case, using the Church Committee to dive deeply into the operation. Gottlieb missed 8,000 pages of mainly financial records that proved MKUltra existed. Declassified documents from the hearings speak about how one of the most frightening parts of the case is that only a few people that led the experiments know the scope of the project. When Sidney Gottlieb spoke to the Church Committee, he pretended that he didn't remember much of the project and tried to deny its existence. He lied directly to them. During the investigation, the committee found that 149 sub-projects were connected to behavioral modification, drug acquisition, and testing or administering drugs surreptitiously. Declassified documents had proof of the testing during Operation Midnight Climax on unwitting test subjects and criminals held at state hospitals. The executive order on intelligence activities was issued by President Gerald Ford in 1976, designed to prohibit uninformed experimentation on human subjects, accompanied by written, informed consent. Declassified documents also spoke about the strange death of Frank Olson. MKUltra had been in effect for 7 months when scientist Frank Olson attended a semi-monthly retreat for those closest to the operation. Even the project scientists weren't immune from being test subjects, and he was given a drink spiked with LSD that night. No special treatment was given to the people who were closest to Gottlieb, who wanted to know if scientists would reveal secrets if they were drugged. When he got home, his behavior was very odd. He wouldn't eat and barely engaged with his family. After telling his wife he'd made a horrible mistake, his paranoia grew, and he was panicking about the work he'd been doing. He attempted to resign from his job and was sent to New York to meet with a doctor. Later, he jumped out of a window at the Hotel Pennsylvania a few days later. The night manager found him and said he didn't die immediately and was mumbling something strange before he arrived. Many believe that foul play was to blame. Olson jumped through a closed window in his underwear, gaining enough momentum as he ran across the room to break the glass while still missing the 2 beds that would have been in his way. His family was told that he had a psychiatric episode and either jumped or fell. An autopsy conducted later showed cuts and abrasions on his body that were unrelated to his fall. In 1975, when information about MKUltra came to light, his family was told that he was drugged days before his death. They threatened to sue, prompting the government to offer them a settlement of $750,000, worth $3.8 million today, and President Gerald Ford issued a formal apology. In 1994, his son Eric Olson asked for a second autopsy. The forensic team found a large bruise on his head and a considerable injury on his chest. They believe these injuries were probably sustained before he fell, referring to it as evidence of a homicide. How they preserved the body to do autopsies that many years later, I don't know. If you work at a morgue or you're an autopsy guy, let me know in the comments. The CIA claims that MKUltra and similar experiments have been indefinitely abandoned. Gottlieb referred to the whole operation as useless, but that could just be an effort to separate himself from it. Despite his immoral and unethical practices, he never faced legal ramifications for his actions. He targeted and tortured society's most vulnerable people, but was protected by those in the highest positions at the CIA. In a book by the New York Times journalist Stephen Kinzer, he was given the title Poisoner-in-Chief.
Good thing the Cold War is over and the government cleaned up their act and aren't involved in any shady things. Aren't we blessed?